My mother, Donna, tells the story of what it was like to grow up in a small town where she was very poor. In fact, it was something that everyone had indoor plumbing, but they still had an outhouse. And that outhouse was dirty and smelly, and she would have to go out in the middle of the night and use it. And that was bad enough, but as she got older and she would have dates come over, her boyfriends would have to go and use that dirty outhouse. And then worst of all is every year at Halloween, it was the town prank to go ahead and pick up that outhouse and carry it down to the center of town. And since they were the only family that had the outhouse, everyone knew it was hers. And so she would be blushing in shame, and all of her friends around her were laughing. And they really probably didn't even know how deeply that was hurting her and how those lies of shame began to go into her life and heart. And I want to read just a couple of those lies from your chapter, because lies, they're deceptive. Lies, something is wrong with me. It's all my fault. I'm not good enough. I will never measure up. Have you heard that one? Those quiet, insidious thoughts. You know, shame is a dark cloud that comes from the enemy. Shame accuses the essence of who you are. Shame makes you feel like something is wrong with you, whereas grace is the rainbow of God's covenant. Grace brings out the joy of who you are, and grace is God's gift. You can't earn it, but you can receive it by faith. The truth of God's grace is that grace is unmerited, it's undeserved favor. You have a gift available to you. Grace frees you from sin. Grace empowers you to be truly you. Breaking the shame cycle can be a process of healing, just like every other area. And shame is something that may start out as embarrassment, but it may turn into a whole pattern of hiding. So one time that I experienced shame had to do with something so little. My parents wanted me to take piano lessons. So they would give me money and I would put it in my pocket and I would walk to the piano teacher. Well, this worked for a while, but there was one problem. The piano that I practiced with at home, they'd found it in a barn, okay? And so middle C did not work and E stuck. So if you know how to play piano at all, you know that I was doomed in learning the scales. So there I was one day with my piano teacher, and she put the lid down and then she looked at me and she said, "Do you practice?" And of course I wasn't. And I remember feeling that red shame. But it got worse because I didn't want to tell my parents that I'd failed. And so I had to figure out, what do I do? So basically I began, I don't even know how long this went on. I think it could have been a couple of months, that I would pretend to walk to the piano lesson, but instead I'd go and I'd walk around town. And if I had a little bit of piano money, I spent it. But what was even worse is I began to steal. And I'd walk around with an old jacket and I had the piano books underneath, and I would take things like pencils and glitter and erasers and gum, and I would just stick them in my pocket and just walk off. Well, the last day that this had happened, I'd come into the drugstore and they proudly realized that once a week I was coming in here and taking things. And I was so thankful that when she came around the corner and said, "What's under your jacket?" it was my piano books. But that was it. I was so afraid. And can you imagine when you are hiding that from your parents? And I wasn't very old. I was 8, 9, 10. And so finally, a week later, when I was supposed to go to piano lessons, I didn't go. And I went home on the bus, and finally my mother came home and she said, "Honey, weren't you supposed to be at piano?" And finally, it all came gushing out of my mouth. My lie and my shame and my cover up and my stealing. And you know, my mom was so wonderful. And I remember just crying and leaning against the softness of who she was and feeling safe. Because here's the thing about shame. It tries to separate you from others, and often from the very people that can help you. You're isolated and you feel like no one will understand. And I know that that's like a childhood story, but even now it brings tears to my eyes because it hurts so deeply to be covered up, to be ashamed, to feel like I needed to hide things. And here's what I want to challenge you to do. If you've been sitting in group and you've let everybody else share, but you've held back because you felt like what you were dealing with was too bad and too awful, I want you to take a risk and share some of that pain. Just don't overshare, but what you feel comfortable sharing, share it. And then everyone in the room, I just want to encourage you. Be a vessel of God's grace. Be a vessel of God's truth and His love and His transformation. We are not here on this earth to fix each other. I have no power to fix you. Jesus is the great fixer. He is the one that died on the cross. He suffered the shame on your behalf, and He delivered you out of shame, out of pain, and He has healed you and set you free. So now, because of the goodness of God's grace, let's make it even at the foot of the cross, and we all come needing Him, and let's minister that grace, that healing, that love, that forgiveness, that freedom to one another.